Anyway, there was this slab of rock, like a big sheet of, like slate, only of course it was limestone. But it was, and as he took his party through, it went, the rattles in there. And he said, all right, folks, let's get on. There's so much over here to see. And he got his party out of there in a hurry without alarming them about, I hear a rattlesnake. And so he came back and told Dad about it. And Dad says, well, we'll have to do something about that one of these days soon. And so it was a warm day, and Dad decided to take a nap. And so Harry thought, well, this is my opportunity. I'm going to upstage Dad for one time. I'm going to steal the show on him. So he took himself a small stick of dynamite and the fuse and cap and everything, and a rifle, and he had a long 7-battery flashlight, and went over there, unbeknownst to Dad, and he set his dynamite under this slab where it wouldn't do any damage, but it would get the snakes out. So after the smoke had cleared away, he went in, and with his flashlight in his left hand and his rifle, I don't know why he didn't take a pistol, but anyway, he took his rifle with one hand, and as he went into this hall, the floor was covered. There were 9 rattlesnakes on the floor.
Whoa!
They were not sidewinders, they were big mountain rattlers, which of course I don't think they're as dangerous as a sidewinder. And so there they were on the floor, so he went boom, 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 and he got all 9 of them, and put them in a sack and brought them back. And I've got a picture of these snakes laid out on the concrete here. And Dad was so mad at him. They always got along like brothers. I mean, they were just good company for each other. But he was so mad at Harry. He said, well, you damn fool. He said, you could have gotten yourself killed. He said, nobody in their right mind would do a thing like that. He read them all for an hour, I think. And I think mostly, though, he was concerned that somebody else had stolen his thunder, because Dad was quite a showman. One time here, do you know Alan Hale?
Yes, played the skipper on Gilligan's Island.
Well,
his son,
yeah.
Alan Hale Sr. and there's Alan
No, well,
Hale
this was Alan Hale Sr.
Okay.
And he was a tough man. Well, this was in about 1935 or so, and so he and his buddy, his henchman, were sitting up here, and one of the boys that was working here with us was pouring whiskey for him, his own whiskey, and they had water glasses, and he'd say, oh, a little more, and he'd get about so much in a water glass, he'd say, that's good. And he was watching Dad. Dad was right down below there, and he had picked up a rattler, and he would take, the way he'd pick up a snake was to take his walking cane and put it down on the snake's head, pick it up by the tail and snap it and break its back. And then he tied it up through something here just below the porch, and Alan Hale was sitting right where that stalactite is, and just looking over, drinking his whiskey. And Dad slid it down the belly, and he was going to skin it and take the head, skin and all. And he had been doing all his concrete work around with the limestone, and he had some sores eaten on the back of his hand where the limestone had attacked his skin. He had fair skin. He was a blue-eyed blonde. And so in taking the skin off the head, taking the head off, he accidentally broke the venom bag and spilled some of it. You could just see, I saw it just run on his hand. And that was the end of the act. He quickly stopped. And Mother had been watching too, and she ran in and she got some blue diamond crystal. It was something that we used for an antiseptic, stronger than iodine. She poured some hot water from the kettle on the stove and fixed this to soak his hand and draw the poison out. And she was terribly concerned. And anyway, Alan Hale got to see what it was to be a really tough guy. No, he liked the show, and he was a good showman, and he'd never quit as long as anybody had listened to him. Worse than I am. Well, anyway, about Camp Clipper, it's in the book. It's in his book.
Yeah, there
some,
seems to be
some.
more.
But I was with Dad. I had come out because I had broken down with TB, and I had a bout with tuberculosis when my older daughter was a baby, and so I broke down again during the war after the birth of this girl, and so I said, well, I'm not going to the hospital again, and Mother had written and said, why don't you come out and let me take care of you? Good clean air and good food and lots of rest. You don't have to do anything. So I came out by train, and then going back, when I went home, I decided I was going to have to go home and have surgery, that I was getting worse instead of better, even with all the loving care and kindness. And so Dad was taking me down the road, and we got to the turn off the Finner Road, and we were stopped by a military guard, one of the black soldiers when the black troops were in. And this young soldier stopped us, halted us, and Dad looked out. He said, yes. He said, I'm Jack Mitchell. He said, I'm Jack Mitchell. This is my road. I built it. And God said, the secretary said, this is military, whatever. And he said, your public is not allowed here. And Dad says, well, we'll see about that. And he reached over for the glove compartment to get this fellow's rank and serial number and so on, or the provost officer's name, or I don't know what, but anyway, he was going to reach for a pencil and notebook. And the guard took it as he was reaching for a rifle, a pistol or something. He stood there and he thought he was going to get his first war victim right now. And first gun action. And so that's all that was my only experience. We didn't get to go. We went by way of Finner, but later Dad talked to the officers in charge, and he tells in his book how he capitalized on, naturally that cut off all their tourist travel, which they were living on, and so he always had a way of turning bad apples into good applesauce. And so he talked to the officers down there and convinced them that this would be a nice outing, a nice hike for their soldiers to do for maneuver practice. And when they got up here, he'd see to it that they had plenty of fresh water for their canteens for the trip back, and a little entertainment and a chance to relax and be happy. And in the meantime, they had cabins for rent, and so they rented them to the officers' families. Oh, Bolivar.
Yeah, living in the drinking water, right?
Well, yeah, until they ate him.
Where'd Bolivar come from?
Well, Bolivar was Dad and who was it? Harry or
No, it was
Russell?
Lloyd.
They went down the Needles to go fishing in Lake Havasaw, and they came back with a real lucky catch of a whole lot of catfish, and more than they could eat, and the fish aren't so good canned, and so they kept put one in the one of the reservoirs up above, and so Dad would go up. Oh, he figured that his ecological excuse for putting Bolivar up there was that he would catch the gnats and flies and things that fell into the open reservoir and keep the water clean. And so he'd gather up a handful of worms, and when he was gardening around the trees and so on, and he'd go up and he'd hold a dangly worm up in front of the over the fish, to attract the fish, and Bolivar would come up and eat out of his hands. And one day Mother called him at the opportune moment when he had his handful of fish. Dinner was ready or something. There were visitors here that needed him or something. And so he ran down, threw the leftover worms into the water all at once, and came down to the cabin and And so a couple of days later, nights, everybody was going to bed, and Mother went in to get herself a good night drink of water out of the faucet in the kitchen. And when she let go to draw the water, here came a plop, and she hadn't turned the light on, and she got a mouthful of worms. And she started spitting and sputtering and used strong language on Dad for being a darn fool for throwing all those worms in there at one time for that fish. And so he said, all right, I'll get rid of it. And so he said, I had to eat my pet. And so that was the second animal. Once they had a badger that he named Jasper, and he had caught the badger when he first came out to keep him company, and before Mother came, and so that was a poor substitute for Mother, I'm sure. But anyway, he petted the badger and loved it. And once when they got tired of eating cottontail and so on, they decided to find out what badger would taste like, and so they killed Jasper. But that was the last time they ever ate it. It was fatty. Dad had the equivalent of a third grade schooling, probably less than that. But when he came out of the Spanish-American War, he had become aware. Well, his life growing up with these horse traders and just handyman work, like a poor Texas boy with no school learning, you know. And school's important, isn't it? On where we go in life, it's important that we have some schooling. And so when he lied added 3 years to his age and joined up in the Spanish-American War. And there he was exposed to educated people among his officers and so on. And he wanted to be like they were. And oh, by the way, he was also a first-rate boxer and athletic instructor on his return trip when he was stationed at San Francisco at the Presidio there. And he went back to Texas and saw all his relatives and his mother, and he did odd jobs around, and then he found out that there was a beautiful school teacher in the little one-room schoolhouse, and so he went up to her and he said, he tells in his story that he went in, and Mother said, oh, he was so handsome and tall and straight in his uniform. And he went in and he said, Miss Idabel Wyatt, Corporal Jesse Mitchell here. I would like to enter your schoolroom and have lessons from you. And so the way he tells it the story, he said, do you suppose you could learn me anything? And she said, Mr. Mitchell, I doubt there's anything I could learn you, but I certainly could teach you a lot. And so immediately he fell in love, and before the day was over, so he tells the story, he proposed to her. And then he was killed right out here in this yard.
How was he killed?
Dad was always taking somebody in. Well, I don't think he ever paid anybody to work here, but he made it a pleasure for people to work. I mean, during the Depression, when most of this development was done, all anybody could expect out of life was 3 meals a day if they were lucky and a roof over their head. And so anybody that wanted to come out and stay with him, it was better than a CCC camp. And so he let him come out and dig rocks and build trails and do whatever their talents led them to do. And it was always a big happy family. Well, anyway, my oldest sister had been married to a man who was born a millionaire, but he was orphaned when he was about 8 years old or so, and he grew up in the family of a friend of his father's. And he never learned. I mean, having money is a responsibility. It's a privilege, but it's also a responsibility. You have to know what to do with it. Not knowing what to do with it, he went to the dogs in a hurry and was drinking and carousing and so on. And so my sister, after 2 children, decided that she'd had enough of it, and she left him and eventually married another man, very fine man. And anyway, after they had been long divorced, and Dad was up here, he went down to Needles, and somebody, I guess it was my sister Ruth, told him that Ted was staying in a motel there. And so Dad went in and found him in the middle of a bunch of empty bottles, and Dad said, "Well, son," he said, "I've come to take you home. I want to take you up to the caves with me." And Ted says, "Oh, what would Mama say?" And Dad says, she'd welcome you, son. So they took him in, and Dad says, "Now you're going to straighten out." And he said, "We're going to leave the liquor alone." And so everything was going fine. And there was a young woman in Needles who had a nervous breakdown. And she was a very fine woman, Mormon woman with good background, good moral character and all. But anyway, she came up here she had been up as a visitor and gotten acquainted with the folks, and she said, "Oh, the doctor said you've got to have some complete rest, otherwise you're going to wind up in the hospital." And so she remembered how nice it was up here and peaceful and how nice the folks were. So she came up and rented one of the cabins. And at 45 or so, Ted was my ex-brother-in-law, was a very good-looking man. He was as handsome as any movie star I've ever seen. And so immediately sparks began to fly, I guess. And before long, Ted was taking coffee over to her room and so on, which wasn't one of the usual amenities of the house. And so this lady, I call her Pearl, she came and she called my father Dad, because she'd been here for a few months, and, instead of being more formal, she said, "Dad, Ted wants me to marry him. What do you think?" And Dad says, "Pearl, you've got 2 or 3 children, whatever it was, of your own now. You don't need another one. And Ted is just a boy. He'll never grow up. You don't need him." And so Blabbermouth Pearl goes to Dad and says, it goes to Ted and says, "Ted, Dad says that I don't need another kid, that you're not ever going to mature." And so I had never seen Ted be violent, but we all felt that he had been responsible for the death of his 2 children by my sister, and had tried to cause the youngest one to miscarry by pulling some shenanigans. And so Ted and Pearl went into San Bernardino for a rendezvous or something. And when they came back, they drove, he was driving Pearl's car, and he drove into the upper building up there, into the rock facing on it. And in doing so, he bent the front undercarriage of the car against the wheels. Well, he managed to back it down and turn it facing down the hill, but it wouldn't go forward because of the position of the fender and bumper on one of the wheels. I don't know which one it was. And in the meantime, Pearl was, Dad went out, and he said, "Well, come on in, have a bite of breakfast." They were just having breakfast. He said, "Come in and have breakfast." And so after breakfast, Ted says, "Dad, that car won't move forward. Would you pull the front wheel, the stuff that's against the wheel? Will you pull it out? Because I've got my good clothes on." And Dad always wore tans, khakis, around the place. And so he was 70 years old at the time, but a strong, healthy man, good condition. And so Mother looked out the window. She said, "Opal, Pearl, your car's rolling downhill and Dad is under it." And the car was going right down that hill. It stopped at the rock wall down there. And it had run over Dad. And he had been there prying like so, and his boot marks had dug holes in his hard ground here. That's how hard he had struggled. Ted was standing beside the driver's seat car door, just behind, outside the door. He could very well have released the brake, who knows, but he did nothing at all, no effort at all to stop. And for a vehicle to start moving, at first its momentum is slow and controllable, and once it gets going, it's gone. And so we went in. Mother said, "Help me." She said, "Go get a blanket, Ted." And he went in to one of the cabins, and he looked all around. He was gone quite a while, and finally came back. He said, "Well, it took me a little while because I didn't want to use one of the good blankets, one of your good blankets. I was, because Dad was all bloody. You don't look. You don't look for what you just grab. I mean, you'd grab a sable coat if you needed it, whatever was close." And so she saw that there was nothing that she could do. The injury was so bad, so she said, "Well, we've got to get him into the doctor's." And Needles, 60 miles away, was the closest help that they could get. And so they got about halfway down the road, and they got Dad into the back seat, and Mother was kneeling. Dad was 6 foot tall, over 200 pounds, but not fat. And Mother was 5 foot tall, and she knelt on the floor beside him and cradled him in her arms. And pretty soon she said, "Stop the car, Ted. Dad doesn't need me anymore." And his dying words were, "Mom, I won't be able to finish the book. You'll have to write the last chapter." And so that was. So when we, after the funeral, my husband went to. The whole family rushed out. Of course, we got phone calls from my sister who lived in Needles, and so they. My husband, who was a very capable person, went to the sheriff's department and reported what had happened. And he said, "We are all nervous about this, and we would like to have you come out and size the situation up." And as we were coming up the road, Ted was going down into Essex, and he got out of the car and said hi, and he had my dad's revolver on his gun belt. And so my husband says, "Oh, he doesn't need that." And so we came up here, and I had gotten some sedative for my mother because she was a very strong little woman, but very dainty and feminine. But her fiber was pure steel. I mean, she was a very remarkable person, and so she couldn't get any rest, and so Dad. I had gotten the sedative for her. Well, we got up here. Cynthia and I, my oldest sister and I, were both like, having seen Ted with his gun strapped to him. We were both like, "Oh, what are we going to do?" We went around trying to do everything they do in the movies, and we found guns, BB guns, 22s, shotguns, rifles, all this paraphernalia around. And for some reason, we were very careful not to touch anything with our hands. It was not a fingerprint case, but we got some clean dish towels, and we picked up all the guns in the place and wrapped them carefully. And so Ted went over to one of the little cabins up there where he was staying when he got back. And my husband went and followed him in. And he said, all right, Ted, I'll take the gun. And Ted says, it's my gun. I gave it to Dad. And Harry says, all right, now you're giving it to me. And my husband, he was not a big man, but he was a very brave person. He said, my husband said, just put the gun on the bed and get out. Well, I guess Ted suspected that we didn't like him very much at that moment. And so it was not until the next morning that the sheriff came up, and we were having breakfast in the room over here. And the sheriff came in, and after a while Ted came in all packed and dressed to leave. And, you know, at the time, the ordinary thing would be to say, Mom, what can I do? You need me. You know, I'm here. And he had stayed here to watch the place while we had gone in for the funeral services. And so anyway, this sheriff's deputy came in, and he was a young, inexperienced fellow, I'm sure. And so when Ted came in, he entered with a, oh, I'm not guilty, I didn't do anything. What's all this about, you know? Well, if it had been an experienced, hardened officer, he might have said, oh, I think you have, let's hear about it now, you know? That's my dramatic idea of it anyway. And so with that, he left. And we all know in our hearts that he did this on purpose. He had a certain spiritual quality about him. He wasn't a church-going man, but it seemed that God was with him wherever he was, in every blossom on every flower, and every little animal, and the sunrises, and you could see the colors in the sky that other people just took for granted. And he loved this place.